At his elite investor appreciation party, my son took the handcrafted music box, his mother's dying gift, and shoved it deep into a bucket of freezing ice and champagne. "Trash belongs with trash," he hissed, nodding for security to escort me out. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I simply reached into that freezing water, pulled out the dripping walnut box, and walked away. When I took it to a master watchmaker later that night to dry the gears, the old man opened the brass backplate, and his face went completely white. "Sir," he stammered, flipping the lock on his shop door. "Do not leave. You have no idea what your late wife hid inside this mainspring. If you are just tuning into this story, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today." The glare of the Silicon Valley penthouse was almost blinding. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, arrogant view of the city below. But inside, the air was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and vintage champagne. It was an investor appreciation party for Caldwell Tech, a software logistics firm that was just days away from a massive initial public offering. The room was packed with venture capitalists, tech billionaires, and socialites, dressed in designer clothes that cost more than most people make in a decade. And then there was me. I am William Caldwell, a 70-year-old retired machinist. I stood near the edge of the room in my worn 10-year-old charcoal suit, holding a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. My hands, permanently calloused and stained with the faint, indelible shadows of machine oil from 50 years of honest labor, felt heavy. I felt entirely out of place, a ghost of a blue collar, past haunting this glittering temple of the future. But I was not there to drink champagne or rub shoulders with the elite. I was there to fulfill a promise. Before my wife Evelyn passed away from cancer, she had commissioned a master watchmaker to craft a beautiful, solid walnut music box. She made me swear on her hospital bed that I would hand it directly to our son Preston on the exact day he reached the pinnacle of his career. Tonight was that night. I navigated through the sea of silk dresses and tailored tuxedos, keeping my eyes fixed on Preston. He was 35, wearing a custom suit that fit him like a second skin, holding court with a group of gray-haired banking executives. Beside him stood his wife Brooke, a 32-year-old woman whose sharp, calculated smile always made my stomach turn. I stepped forward, clutching the package tight to my chest. "Preston," I said, my voice barely carrying over the smooth jazz playing in the background. He turned, and the charming smile he was giving the bankers instantly vanished, replaced by a flash of raw, unfiltered irritation. He quickly excused himself and grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the investors and into a quieter alcove near the bar. Brooke trailed right behind him, her eyes scanning my outdated suit with naked disgust. "What are you doing here?" Preston hissed, keeping his voice dangerously low. "I told you this was a closed corporate event. You look like you just walked off a factory floor. You are embarrassing me in front of the people who are about to hand me $80 million. I swallowed the hard lump in my throat, forcing myself to stay calm. "I came because of your mother," I said, unwrapping the brown paper spool to reveal the polished walnut music box. The brass gears glinted under the harsh penthouse lights. "She wanted you to have this tonight. She said it was for when you finally made it to the top." Brooke let out a sharp, mocking scoff. "A music box, really? William Preston is about to close the biggest tech acquisition of the decade, and you brought him a dusty antique toy." She crossed her arms, leaning into Preston. "I told you we should have had security screen the guest list better." Preston stared at the beautiful wooden box, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. There was no grief in his eyes for the mother who had adored him, no respect for the father standing in front of him. There was only a cold, venomous arrogance. "Do you have any idea what is at stake tonight?" Preston demanded, stepping closer so I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "I am entertaining sharks. Sharks who look for any sign of weakness. And here you are, a living, breathing reminder of a pathetic working-class background I have spent my entire adult life trying to erase." Those words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This pathetic working-class background was exactly what had paid for his elite private schools, his college education, and his lavish wedding to Brooke. But worse than that, it was the very foundation of the company he was currently celebrating. 3 years ago, when Preston had been desperate begging for seed money to launch Caldwell Tech, no bank would touch his business plan. I was the one who went to the bank. I mortgaged the home Evelyn and I had lived in for 40 years. I handed him $2 million in cold, hard cash, risking my entire life savings, my retirement, and my security just to see him succeed. "You did not build this alone, Preston," I reminded him softly, my grip tightening on the music box. "This firm exists because your mother and I sacrificed everything we had for you." Preston snatched the music box from my hands so violently it nearly scratched my skin. "Sacrifice," he sneered, looking down at the delicate brass handle. "You gave me pocket change. I am the one who turned it into an empire. You gave me a loan, and I outgrew you. I outgrew both of you." He turned toward the extravagant marble bar. Sitting on the counter was a massive silver bucket filled with crushed ice and freezing water, chilling several bottles of expensive champagne. Without a second of hesitation, Preston raised the music box and plunged it directly into the ice water. He pushed it deep beneath the freezing slush, drowning Evelyn's dying gift. "Trash belongs with trash," he whispered, looking me dead in the eye. "Now get out of my penthouse before I have security throw you out." Brooke laughed softly, a cruel, satisfied sound, as she turned her back to me and picked up her champagne flute. She did not even consider me a human being anymore. I was just a nuisance that had finally been dealt with. I stood there for a moment, listening to the ice crackle in the bucket. I did not scream. I did not throw a punch. The rage inside me was too absolute, too profound for a cheap outburst. I walked over to the silver bucket, reached my bare hand into the freezing water, and pulled out the soaking wet music box. The icy water bit into my knuckles, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in my chest. Water poured from the brass fittings. I wiped it gently with the sleeve of my worn charcoal suit, turned around, and walked out the heavy glass doors of the penthouse without saying another word. The elevator ride down to the street level felt like an eternity. The mirrored walls of the elevator car reflected a tired, gray-haired man holding a dripping piece of wood, looking every bit the fool Preston thought I was. But as the floor numbers ticked down, the shock began to recede, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. My son had not just humiliated me. He had desecrated his mother's final wish. He had taken the $2 million I bled for, built an empire, and decided I was garbage. I got into my old truck, parked blocks away. I knew I needed to get the music box opened immediately. If the internal cylinders and the mainspring rusted, the mechanism would be destroyed forever, and Evelyn's final gift would be truly gone. I drove straight to the historic district, praying that Felix Klein was still working late. Felix was a 68-year-old master watchmaker from Germany, a man who understood the soul of mechanical things. When I arrived, the lights in his small, cluttered shop were still on. He let me in, taking one look at my pale face and the dripping walnut box in my hands. The shop smelled of brass polish and aged cedar, a sanctuary of order and precision. Clocks ticked in unison around us, a rhythmic heartbeat that grounded my racing thoughts. He quickly set the box down on his velvet workbench, adjusting his magnifying loupe over his right eye. "It has been submerged," I said, my voice finally trembling just a little. "Please, Felix, you have to save the gears. It was my wife's." Felix nodded grimly, pulling out a set of precision screwdrivers. He carefully unfastened the brass backplate. He used a small cloth to absorb the water pooling around the winding key, then gently lifted the mechanical heart out of the wooden casing. I watched him work my chest tight, with a suffocating grief. Suddenly, Felix stopped. The small tweezers in his hand froze in midair. He leaned closer to the intricate brass cylinders, his breathing hitching. He slowly lowered his tools to the table. He looked up at me, the color completely draining from his weathered face. He walked past me, turned the lock on the front door, and pulled the blinds shut. "Mr. Caldwell," he stammered, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. Do not leave this shop. You have no idea what your late wife hid inside this mainspring. I stood completely frozen as Felix reached into his drawer for a specialized pair of titanium tweezers. The smell of brass polish hung heavy in the room. The rhythmic ticking of 100 antique clocks echoed around us, marking the passage of a life I suddenly did not recognize. His usually steady hands trembled slightly under the harsh fluorescent bulb. With agonizing slowness, he reached into the tiny, complex brass heart of the music box. He bypassed the delicate teeth and carefully extracted a small object wrapped in a thin, waterproof silicone membrane. It was a micro-storage drive entirely out of place among the antique gears. Felix set it gently on the green velvet mat and looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound fear and deep sorrow. Evelyn came to my shop 2 weeks before she passed away, he said. She was so weak, William. She could barely stand on her own 2 feet. But she brought me this memory card and gave me very specific, very strange instructions. She paid me handsomely to dismantle the mainspring casing and wedge this drive deep inside the core. She told me to secure it so perfectly that it would only ever be discovered if the box was either smashed to pieces or completely dismantled by a professional. She knew, William. She knew it would end up back here. My chest tightened until I could barely draw a breath. I stared at the tiny black square of plastic resting on the velvet. Why would Evelyn, a brilliant former certified public accountant who had managed every penny we ever earned with absolute transparency, hide a digital drive in her dying days? And why guarantee that Preston would be the one to trigger its discovery? I did not say another word to Felix. I thanked him quietly, took the damp music box, slipped the tiny memory card securely into the breast pocket of my suit, and walked out into the cold night air. The drive back to my modest apartment was an absolute blur. The streetlights bled into long yellow streaks across my windshield. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my arthritic knuckles ached with a dull, throbbing pain. I kept hearing Preston's voice in my head over and over again. Trash belongs with trash. I remembered his cruel, dismissive laughter. But louder than his voice was the deafening silence of my wife's hidden secret burning a hole in my pocket. When I got back to my empty apartment, I sat at my small kitchen table and booted up my old laptop. I stared at the screen as it hummed to life, dread pooling heavy and cold in my stomach. While waiting, my mind involuntarily drifted back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon exactly 6 months ago. It was after Evelyn's funeral. Rain beat against the windows, masking the sound of my weeping as I stared at her empty chair. I was a hollow shell consumed by suffocating grief, barely able to remember to eat or sleep. Preston had come over to visit, bringing Brooke with him. They had brought a thick stack of complicated legal documents and laid them out on this very same kitchen table. Brooke wore a black designer dress, attempting to look mournful, but her eyes kept darting impatiently toward the expensive watch on her wrist. Preston had put a warm hand on my shoulder, looking at me with what I thought was deep, genuine filial concern. "Dad," he had said softly, his voice full of practiced empathy. "The company is growing much faster than we ever anticipated. The initial public offering is moving forward rapidly, and the venture capitalists are starting to comb through our capitalization table. We need to restructure the ownership shares to keep things moving." Brooke had chimed in smoothly, pouring me a cup of hot chamomile tea with a sympathetic, honey-sweet smile. "It is just standard Securities and Exchange Commission compliance, William," she had told me, placing her manicured hand over mine. "We are setting up a blind trust for your original $2 million investment. This will protect your retirement and keep your assets totally shielded so the corporate lawyers do not bother you during the stressful buyout process. We want you to enjoy your golden years without any anxiety. You have earned it." I was so blinded by sorrow, so desperate to maintain the last surviving piece of my broken family, that I did not read the fine print. I believed my son. I believed the fake tears in his eyes when he hugged me. I took the pen and signed my name on the dotted line, legally surrendering my voting rights and handing over complete uncontested control of my shares to Preston's trust. The lie was absolutely flawless. They played on my overwhelming grief, weaponized my unconditional trust, and painted their naked greed as an act of loving protection. But as I sat there now staring at the small black drive in my hand, the warm illusion of my son's love shattered into jagged pieces. I slid the micro drive into the side port of my laptop. A black command window popped up on the screen immediately. It required a security password. A bold red warning flashed continuously below the text box. It stated clearly that I had exactly 3 attempts before the drive would permanently format and erase all contents to military standards. My heart leaped into my throat. Evelyn was brilliant, methodical, and completely unforgiving when it came to numbers. She left absolutely nothing to chance. I slowly typed in her birth date. Access denied. 2 attempts were remaining. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I typed in our wedding anniversary, the day we eloped in a small chapel 45 years ago. Access denied. 1 single attempt remaining. My breathing grew shallow. If I failed this last attempt, the only remaining piece of my wife, her final message from beyond the grave, would be obliterated forever. My hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling violently. I closed my eyes and tried to think exactly like my wife. What date would she choose? What was the one specific day that defined her ultimate realization about our son? Then it hit me like a physical blow to the head. The memory was a sharp, jagged pain that still haunted my nightmares. I remembered the look on her face when the sun began to set, and she finally realized he was never coming. She did not cry. She just stared down the empty driveway, her spirit quietly breaking. I typed in the exact date of September 14th. It was the day of Evelyn's very first chemotherapy session. The day Preston promised he would drive her to the hospital, but instead flew to Cabo on a luxury yacht, with his tech friends leaving her waiting on the front porch for 3 agonizing hours. I pressed the enter key. The screen flickered, turned green, and access granted appeared. A massive folder opened instantly, revealing thousands of raw, unedited accounting spreadsheets. These were not the polished, glossy financial reports Preston proudly presented to his wealthy investors. These were Caldwell Tech's shadow ledgers maintained secretly by Evelyn before she died. I clicked on the master file, tracing the specific line items tied directly to my $2 million seed money. The numbers were chaotic and horrifying. My life savings had not gone into logistics, software development, or hiring engineers. The money had been fragmented and wired into a dizzying maze of offshore shell accounts. I stared in absolute disbelief at columns listing massive expenditures for cryptocurrency margins, private jet rentals, and Brooks' lavish designer shopping sprees. The company was completely hollow. Caldwell Tech was nothing but a beautiful, fragile mirage. I stood completely frozen as Felix reached into his drawer for a specialized pair of titanium tweezers. The smell of brass polish hung heavy in the room. The rhythmic ticking of 100 antique clocks echoed around us. His usually steady hands trembled slightly under the harsh fluorescent bulb. With agonizing slowness, he reached into the complex brass heart of the music box. He bypassed the delicate teeth and carefully extracted a small object wrapped in a thin, waterproof silicone membrane. It was a micro-storage drive entirely out of place among the antique gears. Felix set it gently on the green velvet mat and looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound fear and deep sorrow. "Evelyn came to my shop 2 weeks before she passed away," he said. "She was so weak, William. She could barely stand. But she brought me this memory card and gave me very specific, strange instructions. She paid me handsomely to dismantle the mainspring casing and wedge this drive deep inside the core. She told me to secure it perfectly, so it would only ever be discovered if the box was smashed to pieces or completely dismantled by a professional. She knew, William. She knew it would end up back here." My chest tightened until I could barely draw a breath. I stared at the tiny black square of plastic resting on the velvet. Why would Evelyn, a brilliant former certified public accountant who had managed every penny we ever earned with absolute transparency, hide a digital drive in her dying days? And why guarantee that Preston would be the one to trigger its discovery? I did not say another word to Felix. I thanked him quietly, took the damp music box, slipped the tiny memory card into the breast pocket of my suit, and walked out into the cold night. The drive back to my modest apartment was a blur. The streetlights bled into long yellow streaks across my windshield. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my arthritic knuckles ached with a dull pain. I kept hearing Preston's voice in my head over and over again. Trash belongs with trash. I remembered his cruel, dismissive laughter. But louder than his voice was the deafening silence of my wife's hidden secret, burning a hole in my pocket. When I got back to my empty apartment, I sat at my small kitchen table and booted up my old laptop. I stared at the screen as it hummed to life, dread pooling heavy and cold in my stomach. I carefully removed the silicone membrane from the micro drive. My hands were shaking now, mirroring the tremors I had seen in Felix just an hour ago. I slid the micro drive into the side port of my laptop. A black command window popped up on the screen immediately. It required a security password. A bold red warning flashed continuously below the text box. It stated clearly that I had exactly 3 attempts before the drive would permanently format and erase all contents to military standards. 3 attempts. One wrong move and whatever my wife had died trying to protect would be wiped out of existence. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the laptop screen casting long shadows across the kitchen walls. While staring at the blinking cursor, my mind involuntarily drifted back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon exactly 1 month ago. It was shortly after Evelyn's funeral. Rain beat against the windows, masking the sound of my weeping, as I stared at her empty chair in the living room. I was a hollow shell consumed by suffocating grief, barely able to remember to eat or sleep. Preston had come over to visit, bringing Brooke with him. They had brought a thick stack of complicated legal documents and laid them out on this very same kitchen table. Brooke wore a black designer dress, attempting to look mournful, but her eyes kept darting impatiently toward the expensive watch on her wrist. Preston had put a warm hand on my shoulder, looking at me with what I thought was deep, genuine filial concern. "Dad," he had said softly, his voice full of practiced empathy. "The company is growing much faster than we ever anticipated. The initial public offering is moving forward rapidly, and the venture capitalists are starting to comb through our capitalization table. We need to restructure the ownership shares to keep things moving smoothly." Brooke chimed in smoothly, pouring me a cup of hot chamomile tea with a sympathetic, honey-sweet smile. "It is just standard Securities and Exchange Commission compliance, William," she had told me, placing her manicured hand over mine. "We are setting up a blind trust for your original $2 million investment. This will protect your retirement and keep your assets totally shielded so the corporate lawyers do not bother you during the stressful buyout process. We want you to enjoy your golden years without any anxiety. You have earned it." I was so blinded by sorrow, so desperate to maintain the last surviving piece of my broken family, that I did not read the fine print. I believed my son. I believed the fake tears in his eyes when he hugged me. I took the pen and signed my name on the dotted line legally, surrendering my voting rights and handing over complete uncontested control of my shares to Preston's trust. The lie was absolutely flawless. They played on my overwhelming grief, weaponized my unconditional trust, and painted their naked greed as an act of loving protection. But as I sat there now, staring at the small black drive in my hand, the warm illusion of my son's love shattered into jagged pieces. The plausible lie they spun so carefully unraveled in the harsh light of reality. Why would a son who claimed to be protecting my retirement throw my wife's dying gift into a bucket of ice? Why would a daughter-in-law who claimed to care about my golden years look at me with such unfiltered disgust? The answer was simple. They never intended to protect me. They intended to erase me. I focused my eyes back on the glowing screen. 3 attempts. I tried Evelyn's birth date. Access denied. 2 attempts were remaining. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I tried our wedding anniversary the day we eloped in a small chapel 45 years ago. Access denied. One single attempt remaining. My breathing grew shallow. If I failed this last attempt, the only remaining piece of my wife, her final message, would be obliterated forever. My hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling. I closed my eyes and tried to think exactly like my wife. What date would she choose? What was the one day that defined her ultimate realization about our son? Then it hit me like a physical blow. The memory was a sharp pain that still haunted my nightmares. I remembered the look on her face when the sun began to set, and she finally realized he was never coming. She did not cry. She just stared down the empty driveway, her spirit quietly breaking. I typed in the exact date of September 14th. It was the day of Evelyn's very first chemotherapy session. The day Preston promised he would drive her to the hospital, but instead flew to Cabo on a luxury yacht with his tech friends, leaving her waiting on the front porch for 3 agonizing hours. I pressed the enter key. The screen flickered, turned green, and access granted appeared. A massive folder opened instantly, revealing thousands of raw accounting spreadsheets. These were not the glossy financial reports Preston presented to his wealthy investors. These were Caldwell Tech's shadow ledgers, maintained secretly by Evelyn before she died. I clicked on the master file, tracing the specific line items tied directly to my $2 million seed money. The numbers were chaotic and horrifying. My life savings had not gone into logistics software development or hiring engineers. The money had been fragmented and wired into a dizzying maze of offshore shell accounts. I stared in disbelief at columns listing massive expenditures for cryptocurrency margins, private jet rentals, and Brooks designer shopping sprees. The company was completely hollow. Caldwell Tech was nothing but a beautiful, fragile mirage. The green glow of this laptop screen cast long, sickly shadows across the walls of my small kitchen. I sat entirely paralyzed, staring at the digital wreckage of my son's empire. Caldwell Tech was nothing but a beautiful, fragile mirage. The sheer scale of the deception stretched out before my eyes in row after row of meticulous, devastating data. Evelyn had always been a master of numbers, a certified public accountant who could spot a missing dollar in a 1,000-page ledger. She had spent the final months of her life while her body was failing quietly, archiving the ultimate proof of our son's betrayal. I scrolled down the master spreadsheet, my calloused finger trembling against the mousepad. There it was. A line item dated 3 years ago, labeled as the initial seed funding. $2 million. That was the money I had secured by mortgaging the home where Evelyn and I had raised him. That money was supposed to pay the salaries of software engineers and secure server space for a revolutionary logistics platform. Instead, within 48 hours of the deposit clearing his account, Preston had fragmented the capital. I traced the digital paper trail. $500,000 was immediately wired to an offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, a generic corporate name. Another $300,000 went straight into high-risk cryptocurrency margin accounts. There were massive recurring deductions categorized vaguely as marketing and consulting fees, but the routing numbers pointed to luxury car dealerships, private aviation charters, and exclusive jewelers in Paris and Milan. Brooke had not been spending the profits of a successful tech company. She had been wearing my life savings around her neck and flying on private jets fueled by my retirement fund. The betrayal settled into my bones like a freezing winter wind. I had spent 50 years working in a machine shop. I knew what a dollar was worth because I had traded my physical health, my sweat, and my youth to earn every single one of them. I had breathed in metallic dust and worked double shifts so Preston could attend preparatory schools with the children of surgeons and senators. I had wanted him to have the opportunities I never had. I had given him everything, and he had taken it all without a shred of hesitation, burning it on the altar of his own arrogant vanity. But the horror did not stop at mere theft. As I dug deeper into the labyrinth of Evelyn's hidden files, a much darker, much more terrifying picture began to form. Caldwell Tech was not just a failed startup propped up by stolen seed money. It was a functioning, highly sophisticated fraud. I opened a folder labeled Vendor Payables. The companies listed there had professional-sounding names, but the routing numbers were cyclical. Money was coming in from mysterious overseas entities, pausing briefly in Caldwell Tech accounts to look like legitimate software licensing revenue, and then bouncing right back out to different offshore accounts. Preston was not just spending my money. He was laundering someone else's. And the volume was staggering. Tens of millions of dollars were flowing through these accounts every quarter. This was not the work of a sloppy kid trying to cover a business failure. This was a structured, deliberate criminal enterprise. And the $80 million acquisition he was celebrating tonight at the penthouse was not a legitimate corporate buyout. It was the final exit strategy. My chest constricted as a terrifying realization slammed into me. I pushed my chair back from the table, my breathing turning shallow and ragged. The blind trust. The legal documents Preston and Brooke had brought to this very table just 1 month ago, right after Evelyn's funeral. Brooke's voice echoed in my head, sweet and laced with poison, telling me it was just standard compliance. They had convinced me to surrender my voting rights and sign over complete control of my shares. But what else had I signed? I was the original founder on paper. My name was on the initial incorporation documents because Preston had needed my credit score to secure the first business lines. If Caldwell Tech was a massive money laundering front, and I was legally bound to the trust that held the foundational shares, I was the perfect target. When the federal authorities eventually noticed the massive irregularities and raided the company, Preston and Brooke would take their $80 million payout and vanish to a country with no extradition treaty. They would leave the authorities with a beautiful, legally binding paper trail pointing directly to a clueless 70-year-old retired machinist. My own son was not just stealing from me. He was actively setting me up to take the fall for a federal crime. He was going to let me die in a federal penitentiary so he could sip champagne on a beach. I closed my eyes, resting my face in my hands. The grief threatened to swallow me whole. I thought about Evelyn lying in her hospital bed, discovering this horrific truth, while the cancer ate away at her body. I thought about the sheer agony she must have felt, knowing the boy she had carried, nurtured, and loved had become a monster. She had spent her last ounces of strength building this digital lifeboat for me. She had hidden it in the one object she knew Preston would despise, the music box, ensuring it would eventually find its way back to my hands. She had known I would need the truth to save myself. When I opened my eyes again, the tears were gone. The suffocating sorrow had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, burning clarity. I was a machinist. I had spent my entire life fixing broken systems, diagnosing mechanical failures, and rebuilding engines from the ground up. I understood how to dismantle a machine piece by piece until nothing was left but scattered parts. Preston had built a machine of lies, and now it was time to tear it apart. But I was out of my depth. I knew gears, pistons, and steel. I did not know the intricate legalities of international wire fraud, offshore shell corporations, or federal financial regulations. I stared at the thousands of rows of data illuminating the dark kitchen. If I took this drive directly to the police right now, I would be handing them evidence of a crime that had my own signature plastered all over the foundational documents. I needed a strategy. I needed a translator. I needed someone who understood the dark, complex language of corporate theft. I could not go to the corporate lawyers at Caldwell Tech. They were either completely oblivious or more likely complicit in the fraud. I could not go to the standard family attorneys who had drafted my simple will. I needed a predator. I needed someone sharp, independent, and completely ruthless. Someone who could look at this massive web of financial deceit and find the exact thread to pull that would unravel Preston's entire empire before the $80 million acquisition closed in just 5 days. I reached for my phone, the screen lighting up with the time. It was 3 a.m. I pulled up a contact I had saved years ago, a woman who had helped a fellow machinist navigate a brutal corporate bankruptcy. She was known for being relentless, brilliant, and completely unafraid of powerful men. I drafted a brief urgent message requesting a completely confidential meeting at dawn. I closed the laptop, ejected the micro drive, and slipped it safely back into my pocket. The clock was ticking, and the war for my survival had just begun. The next morning, before the sun even breached the skyline of the city, I was sitting in a cracked vinyl booth of an old 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts. The air inside smelled strongly of stale coffee and fried bacon. At precisely 6 o'clock, the brass bell above the glass door chimed. Sarah Jenkins walked in. She was a 45-year-old independent forensic accountant. She wore a sharp charcoal blazer and carried a heavy leather briefcase. I had met her years ago when she helped a fellow machinist expose a corrupt factory owner. She was fierce. She was fiercely independent. And most importantly, she had absolutely no ties to Caldwell Tech or my son. Sarah slid into the booth across from me without a single word of unnecessary small talk. I pulled the tiny micro drive from my breast pocket and slid it slowly across the sticky laminate table. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy encrypted laptop. I gave her the password. September 14th. I watched her type it in. I watched her dark eyes narrow as the thousands of spreadsheets flooded her glowing screen. For a very long time, the only sound between us was the rapid, methodical clicking of her keyboard. I drank my black coffee in complete silence. I could see the raw financial data scrolling endlessly across the reflection of her glasses. "William," she finally said, her voice completely tight with absolute disbelief. "Who compiled this massive ledger?" "My wife," I replied softly. Evelyn was a certified public accountant. She spent her final agonizing months putting this entire thing together in secret. Sarah shook her head slowly. Evelyn was an absolute financial genius. This is the most meticulous shadow ledger I have ever seen. She tracked every single cent. She traced routing numbers through shell companies that would take the federal government months to fully untangle. But William, this is not just a record of a failing business. This is a map of a financial slaughterhouse. She turned the laptop slightly so I could see the screen. "Your son is running a massive financial black hole," she explained quietly. "Caldwell Tech is bleeding cash. They have no real software revenue. The money they use to pay overhead is coming from these offshore accounts. And the money going into those offshore accounts is coming from phantom investors. He is moving money in a circle." "A Ponzi scheme," I said. "Worse," she corrected me. "A Ponzi scheme collapses when you run out of investors." Preston is preparing to sell the entire Mirage. The $80 million acquisition scheduled for this Friday is his exit strategy. He is going to sell an empty shell to a foreign conglomerate. But here's the terrifying part, William. The structural documents your son had you sign last month legally insulate him. The blind trust makes you the beneficial owner of the foundational assets. When the buyers realize they bought a hollow company, the federal authorities will follow the paper trail straight to you. Preston will move to a non-extradition country, with Brooke leaving you holding the bag for fraud. The reality of her words washed over me. My own flesh and blood had orchestrated my funeral. He had smiled in my face and signed my death warrant. "We have to go to the authorities right now," I said. "We have Evelyn's drive. We have the proof. We can stop the sale and show the authorities what he is doing." Sarah sighed heavily. "That is where we have a massive problem," she said. "Evelyn was brilliant, but her data stops on the day she went into hospice. These files are 6 months old. In the world of forensic finance, 6-month-old data is a lifetime. Preston's corporate lawyers will argue that this drive is a fabrication. They will claim you made it because you are experiencing cognitive decline. Without current financial data tying him to the buyout, this drive is just history." My heart plummeted. "So what do we do?" I asked. "If we do nothing, he walks away with the money and I go to federal prison." "We need live data," Sarah said firmly. "We need the current transaction logs showing his preparations for the buyout. We need the digital footprint of the money he is moving today. But we cannot get it from the corporate office. His servers there are heavily monitored. He will destroy the servers before the authorities can serve a warrant." "Then how do we get the data?" I pleaded. Sarah leaned forward. "Where does Preston work when he is not at the office?" she asked. "Where does he authorize the international wire transfers?" "At home," I answered immediately. "He has a private server rack locked in his home office at the mansion. He handles all the sensitive offshore communications from his house." "Exactly," Sarah said. "That is our target. We need a live tap into his home network. If we can clone the data flowing through his personal router over the next 72 hours, we will have the undeniable proof to link Evelyn's ledger to his current crimes." I stared at her. "You are talking about breaking into a multi-million-dollar mansion in a gated community," I said. "He has cameras everywhere. He has a private security patrol." "I am not talking about breaking in," Sarah replied. "I am talking about walking right through the front door. You are his father, William. You have a reason to be there. You need to get inside that house. You need to get into his locked office. And you need to install a physical transponder directly into his network switch." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small black object. She set it on the table. It was no larger than a standard shirt button. It had an adhesive strip on the back and a microscopic port on the side. "This is a military-grade network cloner," she explained. "It does not emit a detectable wireless signal. It passively intercepts the data running through the physical cables and transmits it through cellular bands directly to a secure server. But you only have one chance. If you get caught planting this, Preston will panic. He will empty the accounts and flee the country, and the evidence vanishes forever." I looked down at the tiny black device resting on the table. It represented my freedom. It represented justice for Evelyn. And it represented the absolute destruction of my son. Only 5 days. That was all the time I had left before the federal trap snapped shut on my neck. I reached out and slowly picked up the small black device. My calloused hands were no longer shaking. The cold, mechanical precision of my past 50 years as a machinist flooded back into my veins. I knew how to work with delicate components. I knew how to fix broken machines. And Preston's perfect life was the most fundamentally broken and dangerous machine I had ever seen. "I will do it," I said softly. "I will walk right into the belly of the beast and get it done today." The morning sun burned off the coastal fog as I pulled my rusted truck up to the heavy wrought iron gates of Preston's exclusive neighborhood. My heart hammered against my ribs. I gave the uniformed security guard my name. He checked his clipboard, his eyes lingering on my cracked paint before pressing the button. The gates swung open slowly, welcoming me into a world built entirely on my stolen life savings. I drove past sprawling estates with manicured lawns gripping the steering wheel tight enough to make my arthritic knuckles turn white. I pulled into the circular driveway of Preston's modern glass and concrete mansion. It was a cold, imposing structure, devoid of any warmth. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cab. I had to shed my anger. I had to bury the sharp, precise machinist deep down inside and wear the skin of a broken, senile old man. I took a deep breath, slumped my shoulders forward, and let a deliberate tremor enter my hands. I stepped out, my posture bent, shuffling hesitantly on the smooth slate stones. I pressed the illuminated doorbell. Moments later, the heavy door swung open to reveal Brooke. She wore silk loungewear holding a cup of steaming coffee. The moment her eyes landed on me, her expression hardened into pure annoyance. "What are you doing here, William?" she demanded, her voice devoid of any basic human respect. "Preston is getting ready for a massive conference call. We do not have time for another one of your dramatic episodes." I forced my bottom lip to quiver. I stared at the ground, playing the part of a deeply confused elder. "Brooke." "I am so sorry," I stammered, making my voice sound weak. "I do not know what came over me last night. My mind gets so foggy lately. I have not been sleeping well since Evelyn passed. I just wanted to apologize to Preston. I brought shame to his big night, and I cannot bear the thought of him being angry with me." Brooke let out a loud theatrical sigh, rolling her eyes toward the vaulted ceiling. She did not offer a shred of pity. Instead, a cruel, mocking smile crept across her face. She reached into her silk robe and pulled out her smartphone. She held it up, the camera lens pointed directly at my face. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was recording my humiliation to share with her wealthy friends, treating my staged frailty as morning entertainment. "Oh, please continue, William," she said, her tone dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Tell me again how confused you are. I am sure everyone in my group chat will just love to hear your pathetic little apology." It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to reach out and smash that phone. My blood boiled, but I swallowed my pride. I let my hands shake harder. I allowed a single genuine tear of sheer frustration to roll down my wrinkled cheek. "Please, Brooke," I pleaded, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Just let me see him for 5 minutes. I need to know my son forgives me. I do not want to be cast out of the family. I am just a foolish old man who lost his way." Her laughter was like shattered glass. She tapped the screen, finishing the recording with a satisfied smirk. "Fine," she said, stepping aside to let me squeeze past her into the grand foyer. "Wait here in the hall. Do not touch anything. I will go see if Preston has 5 minutes to deal with your nonsense." She turned on her heel and walked up the floating glass staircase. The moment she was out of sight, the trembling in my hands vanished completely. My posture straightened. My tear-stained eyes hardened into cold, calculating focus. I had exactly a few minutes to map out my battlefield. The grand foyer opened into a massive living room, but I knew Preston. He never mixed his high-stakes business with his leisure spaces. He would have a heavily secured room for his servers and sensitive documents. I moved silently across the foyer, my soft-soled shoes making absolutely no sound on the polished marble. I scanned the architectural layout. To the right, a long hallway stretched toward the back of the house. I walked quickly down the hall, my eyes darting from door to door. I was looking for something specific. A standard home office would just have a regular door and a basic lock. A room housing a dedicated server rack dealing with millions of dollars in illegal wire transfers would need serious infrastructure. I found it at the very end of the long, dimly lit corridor. It was a heavy, solid oak door with reinforced steel hinges, but what immediately caught my sharp attention was not the thick wooden door itself. It was the glowing digital biometric keypad mounted securely on the wall right beside the handle. It was a commercial-grade security lock excessive for a residential home. Furthermore, I noticed a subtle secondary ventilation grate installed near the baseboard just outside the room. I knelt down and placed my hand near the slats. I could feel a steady, powerful hum of chilled air pushing out. It was a dedicated cooling unit. That room was not just an office, it was a server farm. Preston's digital fortress was right behind that oak wood. I pulled the tiny military-grade network cloner from my breast pocket. The small black button felt heavy with the weight of my entire future. I peeled the adhesive backing off, readying the device. I needed to get past that biometric lock. I needed a reason to be inside that specific room. I stood up quickly, mapping the distance from the door to the primary router I assumed was sitting on his desk. I calculated the exact number of careful steps and the precise amount of seconds it would take to successfully plug the transponder directly into the primary network switch without getting caught. Suddenly, I heard the heavy, angry footsteps of my son descending the glass staircase in the main foyer. I sprinted silently back down the hallway, rushing to the exact spot where Brooke had left me. I quickly hunched my shoulders forward, let my hands begin to tremble wildly once again, and stared completely blankly at the polished marble floor. I let my jaw go slack, painting the picture of a man completely lost in his own fading mind. Preston rounded the corner, dressed in crisp slacks and a custom dress shirt, his face flushed with irritation. He looked down at me with an expression of profound disgust. "Brooke tells me you are here to apologize." Preston snapped, his voice echoing in the large space. "You have a lot of nerve showing up at my home after the stunt you pulled last night, Dad." I looked up at him, forcing my eyes to widen in staged terror. I reached out a shaking hand, playing the ultimate role of the broken father. "Preston, please," I whispered, my voice breaking perfectly. "I am so confused. My head hurts. I just want to sit down. Please, son. Can we just sit down in your office for a moment? I feel like I am going to faint. I swayed on my feet, buckling my knees just enough to make it look like I was collapsing. Preston cursed under his breath, stepping forward to catch my arm before I hit the floor. The disgust radiating from him was palpable, but he had no choice. Fine, he muttered angrily, dragging me up by the elbow. Come on, do not pass out in the foyer. He pulled me down the hallway, leading me directly toward the heavy oak door with the biometric lock. My heart pounded a furious rhythm against my ribs. The clueless old man act had worked perfectly. I was walking right into the belly of the beast. I took a deep, steadying breath, completely ready for the next extremely dangerous move. Preston dragged me by the elbow down the long hallway. We stopped just inches from the heavy oak door. His hand hovered over the glowing biometric scanner. Before his skin could touch the glass plate, Brooke's sharp voice cut through the tense silence. Preston, she hissed, marching toward us. What exactly are you doing? We have a massive board meeting via video conference in 20 minutes. You cannot bring him in there. Look at him, he is practically drooling on the floor. Preston sighed. I am just going to let him sit on the leather sofa, so he stops making a scene in the foyer. He says he feels faint. If he collapses out here, we will have to call an ambulance. Absolutely not, Brooke snapped. I am not having him blubbering and shaking in the background while we finalize the offshore transfer protocols. You need to get him out of here right now. Come in the kitchen with me. We need to call security and have him escorted off the property. Preston groaned, but he pulled his hand away from the scanner. He pointed a rigid finger directly at my face. Stay right here, he commanded. Do not move a single muscle, Dad. I mean it. He turned and followed Brooke back down the hallway, their angry voices fading as they entered the kitchen. The moment they were out of sight, my slumped posture vanished. The trembling in my limbs ceased instantly. I had 90 seconds, maybe less. I turned to the heavy oak door. Preston had leaned his weight against the door handle when Brooke startled him, and the heavy latch had not fully clicked shut. The door was resting a fraction of an inch ajar. It was a careless mistake born of pure arrogance. I pushed the door open, slipping inside like a shadow, and pulled it shut behind me until it caught with a soft click. The persistent hum of industrial cooling fans filled the air. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, but my eyes bypassed the desk entirely. There it was, tucked into the far corner of the room, hidden behind a ventilated cabinet. A towering rack of dark, blinking servers. I moved across the thick carpet with silent, practiced steps. I knelt on the cold floor. The back panel was secured with complex screws. Most people would have panicked, lacking the proper tools. But I was a machinist. I had spent 50 years working with my hands. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small piece of hardened steel. With a few precise twists, I popped the panel open. A labyrinth of brightly colored Ethernet cables and fiber optic lines greeted me. The core switch was buried deep inside a dense hub of blinking green and amber lights. I pulled the microscopic data cloning transponder from my pocket. My hands, which had faked a pathetic tremor just moments ago, were now as steady as a surgeon holding a scalpel. I isolated the primary uplink cable, the thick blue cord carrying the main data stream out to the global internet. I carefully unclipped the cable, my thumb pressing the plastic tab with the exact amount of pressure required. The green light on the port briefly flickered and died. I had 3 seconds before the network monitoring software would register a drop in connectivity. 1. I slid the tiny black transponder onto the end of the cable. 2. I pushed the modified connector back into the primary port, ensuring the pins aligned perfectly. 3. The green light flared to life, blinking rapidly as the data stream resumed. The transponder was invisible entirely, masked by the thick cluster of surrounding wires. It was a flawless installation. The military-grade cloner was now passively copying every single packet of data flowing into and out of Preston's private servers. Every offshore wire transfer, every encrypted email to his shadow investors, Every piece of evidence needed to prove his ongoing fraud was currently being transmitted directly to Sarah Jenkins. I quickly snapped the back panel of the cabinet into place using my steel tool to secure the screws. Just as I gave the final screw a tightening twist, the heavy oak door behind me clicked loudly. The biometric lock engaged. The handle began to turn. The adrenaline spiked in my chest. I threw the steel tool back into my pocket and forcefully collapsed onto the floor. I dropped to my hands and knees, scrambling wildly across the expensive carpet, my fingers scraping at the fibers. I hunched my shoulders, letting my head bob, and forced my hands to shake violently. The door swung wide open. Preston stood in the doorway, the harsh light from the hallway casting a long shadow across the room. His face contorted into a mask of absolute unfiltered fury. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "I told you not to move." I let out a pathetic, whimpering gasp, not looking up at him. "My pill," I cried out, my voice trembling and weak. "My heart pill. It fell out of my pocket, Preston. I was trying to find it. The doctor said I cannot miss a dose." It rolled under the desk. "Please, I just need to find my pill." I kept swatting aimlessly at the carpet, looking every bit the senile, broken old man they believed me to be. Preston stormed across the room, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the rug. He grabbed me roughly by the back of my suit jacket, hauling me to my feet with a cruel, dismissive yank. He did not care if I was having a medical emergency. He did not care about my heart. He only cared about his sanctuary being violated. "You are losing your mind, old man," he sneered, his breath hot against my face. "You are completely pathetic. You wander into my private workspace looking for a non-existent pill. You are a walking disaster. Get out. Get out of my house right now before I call the police and have you dragged out for trespassing." He shoved me hard toward the door. I stumbled, playing up my frailty, letting my shoulder crash into the doorframe. I did not fight back. I kept my head down, offering a series of broken, mumbled apologies that only seemed to fuel his towering disgust. He marched me down the hallway, past a smirking Brooke in the kitchen, and shoved me out the grand front doors. The heavy wood slammed shut behind me with a definitive echoing thud. The lock clicked into place, sealing them inside their multi-million-dollar fortress. I stood on the slate porch for a moment, letting the cool morning air wash over my face. I slowly straightened my spine. The artificial tremor left my hands, and the fog lifted from my eyes. I walked back to my rusted truck with a steady, measured stride. I climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the circular driveway. As the heavy wrought iron gates closed behind me, my phone buzzed. "Data stream established. We have everything." I smiled. I drove through the awakening city, the rising sun casting a pale, cold light over the industrial district. When I reached my modest apartment, I did not sleep for a single second. I brewed a large pot of incredibly strong black coffee and sat down heavily at my small kitchen table, staring intently at my glowing encrypted laptop screen. Sarah Jenkins had successfully established a highly secure remote connection from her private downtown office. Throughout the dark hours of the early morning, the incoming data stream flowed in a relentless, undeniable river of absolute crushing guilt. We were literally watching Preston authorize massive illegal offshore wire transfers in real time. We possessed the exact routing numbers, the hidden IP addresses, and the specific digital signatures tying him directly to the illegal offshore shell companies. The financial slaughterhouse was fully illuminated. By 7 o'clock, Sarah sent me a brief, secure text message confirming we finally had enough hard evidence to trigger an immediate federal freeze on all Caldwell Tech assets. But we still needed one more crucial piece to completely protect me from the impending legal fallout. We desperately needed a legal firewall signed by Preston himself, completely overriding the restrictive blind trust he had forcefully pushed upon me last month. Sarah had carefully drafted a highly specific, legally binding addendum. I printed it out flawlessly on the thick, textured legal paper that Preston's expensive corporate lawyers always used. I placed the single sheet of paper face down on my kitchen table right next to my steaming coffee mug and waited in absolute silence. At exactly 9 o'clock, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through my small living room. I took a deep, steadying breath, channeled the frail, broken man I had played the day before, and shuffled slowly to the door. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled it open. Preston stood in the narrow hallway, looking utterly out of place in my cramped, worn apartment. He wore a tailored navy blue suit, his hair perfectly styled, his expensive cologne cutting sharply through the smell of my old carpets. He did not ask to come in. He simply pushed past me carrying a thick, black leather folder tightly under his arm. He walked directly into my kitchen, wrinkling his nose at the modest surroundings, and dropped the heavy folder right on top of my small wooden table. I closed the front door and shuffled weakly behind him, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped. I let my hands begin their practiced, pathetic tremor. Preston turned to face me, his expression a mask of practiced, cold sympathy. He was completely ready to play the concerned son, capitalizing entirely on the moment of weakness I had deliberately shown him yesterday. He rested his manicured hands on the leather folder and let out a heavy, theatrical sigh, shaking his head as if burdened by a great, unavoidable tragedy. "Dad, we need to have a very serious conversation," he said, his voice lowering into a tone of patronizing pity. "Yesterday was an absolute disaster. You were crawling around my office floor completely delusional, looking for pills that do not even exist." Brooke was terrified. "I am terrified. Your mind is clearly deteriorating much faster than any of us realized. You cannot live like this, and you certainly cannot manage your own complex affairs anymore." He unzipped the black leather folder and pulled out a thick stack of dense legal documents. "I have spoken extensively with the corporate attorneys and my personal doctors," he continued smoothly. "They all agree that we need to take immediate action to protect you from yourself. These are full power of attorney documents, Dad. They transfer all legal, medical, and financial decision-making authority directly to me. It is for your own good. I need you to sign these right now, so I can legally manage your care and ensure you do not do anything to harm yourself or the impending company buyout." I looked down at the thick stack of papers. The sheer audacity of his naked greed was breathtaking. He was not just stealing my money. He was trying to strip away my fundamental rights as a human being. I forced a thick, wet tear to roll down my cheek. I let out a soft, broken sob, burying my face in my violently trembling hands. "Oh, Preston." I wept, making my voice sound incredibly small and terrified. "I am so scared. My memory is just slipping away so fast. I do not want to be a burden to you and Brooke. I do not want to lose my mind." Preston smiled a fleeting, triumphant smirk that he quickly hid behind a mask of false comfort. He stepped forward and placed a heavy, warm hand on my shaking shoulder. "It is okay, Dad," he murmured softly. "I am going to take care of everything. You just need to sign the papers." He pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and pushed it forcefully into my trembling hand. He flipped the thick stack of documents to the final signature pages. There were several pages requiring both of our signatures to execute the total transfer of power. I fumbled weakly with the silver pen, my hands shaking so violently that I dropped it directly onto the table. I mumbled a pathetic apology and bent over to pick it up. In that brief, calculated moment of distraction, my left hand brushed against the stack of papers. I seamlessly slid Sarah Jenkins's printed addendum right into the middle of the signature pile. The textured paper was an exact match. It blended in flawlessly with his corporate documents. I sat back up, wiping my tear-stained eyes, and took the silver pen again. I signed my name on the first page, intentionally making my signature jagged and sloppy. I flipped to the next page and signed again, keeping my hand shaking. Preston hovered over me, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. He was so incredibly eager to finalize his absolute control that he was not reading a single word of the text above the signature lines. I signed the third page, which was Sarah's hidden addendum, a legally binding document that instantly revoked the blind trust held Preston personally liable for my original $2 million seed investment and granted me full investigative access to all Caldwell Tech financial records. I slid the thick stack across the table to him. Preston grabbed the silver pen from my hand. He quickly flipped through the pages, rapidly scrawling his bold, arrogant countersignature on every single line without pausing for a single second. He signed his own financial death warrant in a rush of blind, absolute greed. He gathered the papers, tapped them neatly on the table, and slid them back into his leather folder, leaving a copied stack behind for my own personal records. He buttoned his suit jacket, offering me one final patronizing smile of absolute false sincerity. He patted my shoulder one last time, turned around, and walked confidently out the door, truly thinking he had finally conquered me completely. He just walked right into a perfect, inescapable steel trap. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind my son. I stood listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. He truly believed he had just legally erased me. He thought he had secured his golden parachute, but the piece of paper resting in my copied file told a different story. My hands were perfectly steady as I picked up my phone and dialed Sarah Jenkins. I told her the trap had been sprung. Preston had signed the counter-signature. The addendum was fully executed. We were legally protected. I now had unrestricted investigative authority over every single asset connected to Caldwell Tech. Sarah told me to get down to her office immediately. The live data stream from the transponder I had planted in Preston's mansion was finally pouring in. I drove across the city with a sense of calm I had not felt since Evelyn got sick. The weight of grief had been replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. I arrived at Sarah's secure downtown office just as the city was waking up. Her workspace was a fortress of digital screens. She sat behind an oak desk, her eyes fixed intently on a cascading wall of green and white text. I pulled up a leather chair beside her. The data we extracted from Evelyn's hidden music box drive was a static snapshot of the past. But the information flowing onto Sarah's monitors right now was a living, breathing creature. It was the real-time financial heartbeat of Caldwell Tech, intercepted directly from Preston's private servers. Sarah's fingers flew across her mechanical keyboard. She had spent the last 12 hours running decryption algorithms to break through Preston's security protocols. Now the final firewalls were coming down. The encrypted packets unraveled before our eyes, translating into clear bank statements, internal emails, and hidden offshore wire logs. We sat in silence as the first major domino fell. Caldwell Tech was supposedly a revolutionary logistics software company, heavily reliant on a proprietary artificial intelligence platform. Preston had pitched this software to hundreds of high-net-worth investors, promising them unprecedented returns. But as Sarah cross-referenced the live development logs with the financial expenditures, the horrifying truth became undeniably clear. The software simply did not exist. There was absolutely no code. There were no software engineers working around the clock. There were no secure server farms dedicated to machine learning. The technological foundation of Caldwell Tech was a complete fabrication. Preston had hired a cheap offshore graphic design firm to create a glossy user interface that did absolutely nothing. It was merely a beautiful empty shell designed to look like a functioning dashboard. He would bring wealthy investors into his boardroom, load up this fake dashboard, and show them simulated logistical data that was entirely pre-programmed. They were buying into a ghost. My chest tightened as Sarah opened the operational ledgers. If there was no product, I asked, my voice barely a whisper, how was he generating these massive quarterly profit reports? How was he keeping the original investors satisfied? Sarah pointed a pen at the scrolling numbers. It is the oldest trick in the book, William, she said grimly. He is running a massive, highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. Look at these wire transfers. When a new investor deposits capital into Caldwell Tech, Preston immediately routes a fraction of that money back to the older investors. He labels it as a software licensing dividend. The old investors see incredible returns on their initial investment, so they tell their wealthy friends. The new friends pour even more money into the company, which Preston then uses to pay the previous wave of investors. It is a continuous vicious cycle built entirely on fresh blood. He has been paying Peter to rob Paul for the last 3 years. The sickening reality of my son's criminal enterprise washed over me. I leaned closer to the monitor, scanning the relentless flow of transactions. I asked Sarah to isolate the routing path of my original $2 million seed investment. That was the money Evelyn and I had saved for 45 years. That was the money generated by 50-hour weeks in a dusty machine shop. Sarah typed a series of commands, filtering the database down to specific dates. The screen shifted, bringing up logs tied directly to my transfer. I watched my life savings evaporate on the screen. The moment my money had cleared Preston's account, he had blown it with breathtaking speed. $500,000 had been instantly wired to an unregulated cryptocurrency exchange. The logs showed he had leveraged the amount on high-risk margins, losing the $500,000 in 3 weeks during a market crash. The rest of the money had not been lost to bad investments. It had been intentionally bled dry by sheer greed. I saw massive recurring payments to a private aviation company. Preston had spent $300,000 chartering private jets for weekend luxury trips. I saw a staggering $200,000 wire transfer to a luxury car dealership for a custom sports car that he never even drove. But the most painful expenditures were linked directly to Brooke's personal accounts. My wife had clipped coupons and bought her clothes at discount stores so we could put food on the table. Brooke had spent over $400,000 of our money on designer handbags, exclusive spa retreats, and custom jewelry. There was a single transaction for a diamond necklace that cost more than Evelyn and I had spent on our first house. They had treated my blood and sweat like endless monopoly money. Caldwell Tech was completely hollow. There were no assets. There were no reserves. The company accounts were virtually empty, operating on a razor-thin margin of incoming investor cash. If the flow of new investors stopped for even a single week, the entire house of cards would instantly collapse. Preston knew this. That was exactly why he was pushing so aggressively for the $80 million corporate acquisition. He needed to sell the hollow shell of Caldwell Tech to a foreign buyer before the scheme imploded. Sarah leaned back in her chair, taking off her glasses and rubbing her tired eyes. "William," she said quietly, "this is much worse than I anticipated. Preston is not just facing civil lawsuits for mismanaging funds. This is wire fraud, securities fraud, and massive tax evasion. The federal authorities will bury him alive. But because he structured the blind trust to make you the beneficial owner the moment this acquisition closes, the foreign buyers will audit the system. When they find out the company is empty, they will alert the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And Preston has left a perfect paper trail leading straight to your front door." I stared at the screen, watching the fake transactions continue to roll in. My son had built an empire of dust, and he intended to use my bones for the foundation. But I had the addendum. I had the transponder. And I had exactly 4 days left to burn his empire to the ground. I looked at Sarah, feeling an absolute, unshakable resolve. "It is finally time," I said softly. "It is finally time," I said softly. Sarah did not reply immediately. Her eyes remained locked on the cascading lines of data illuminating the dark office. The rhythmic clatter of her keyboard shifted into a rapid, aggressive tempo. We had exposed the hollow core of Caldwell Tech. We had watched my life savings vanish into a black hole of sheer vanity and greed. But the real-time network cloner I had planted inside my son's house was capturing something much larger. Sarah was currently tracing the origin of the massive $80 million acquisition fund. Preston had proudly boasted to his wealthy investors that a highly respected European technology conglomerate was purchasing his revolutionary artificial intelligence platform. He had thrown a lavish party at a penthouse to celebrate his own brilliance. But as Sarah systematically dismantled the routing numbers masking the incoming capital, the glittering facade of his corporate triumph dissolved into pure, terrifying darkness. "Look at this routing path," Sarah whispered, her voice tightening with a mixture of professional awe and deep dread. This money is not coming from a legitimate technology sector. It is bouncing through 7 different banking institutions across 4 continents before it even reaches the escrow account. She expanded a complex visual map on her primary monitor. Red lines spidered across a digital globe connecting shadowy financial institutions in jurisdictions known for their absolute banking secrecy. The entity purchasing Caldwell Tech was not a software conglomerate. It was a highly organized, ruthless overseas money laundering syndicate. They were not buying Preston's company for its non-existent artificial intelligence software. They were buying the corporate structure itself. They needed a seemingly legitimate, fully incorporated American technology firm to process and wash tens of millions of dollars of illicit funds. Preston had willingly sold his own phantom company to international criminals trading a hollow startup for an $80 million payday. The sheer scale of the danger sent a cold shiver down my spine. My son was no longer just a thief stealing from his own father. He was actively engaging in massive federal crimes with highly dangerous individuals. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. As Sarah continued to comb through the encrypted data packets flowing from the hidden transponder, she opened a secure folder labeled as corporate compliance. These were the actual registration documents being prepared for the final handover to the overseas syndicate. William, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. I need you to look at this right now. I leaned forward, my chest constricting, as I read the dense legal text displayed on the glowing screen. It was the final ownership registry for the shell corporations being used to finalize the $80 million transaction. My eyes scanned the executive summary. There, printed clearly at the very top of the organizational chart, was my full legal name. I did not understand. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the impossible information. How is that possible? I asked, my voice completely hollow. I handed over my shares. I signed the blind trust documents. I surrendered all my voting rights to Preston just a few weeks ago. Sarah rapidly cross-referenced the files, pulling up the exact documents Brooke had placed on my kitchen table the day after my wife's funeral. Preston did not use the blind trust to protect your retirement, William, she explained grimly. He weaponized it. Look at the fine print buried in these secondary addendums. He used the total transfer of power you signed to completely restructure the corporate hierarchy. He used your personal social security number. He forged your digital signatures on dozens of highly illegal overseas bank accounts. He deliberately removed himself from every single document tying him to the fraudulent cash flow. The room seemed to spin. The air grew thick and heavy. He made you the sole legal chief executive officer of every shell corporation involved in this syndicate transaction. Sarah continued, her words falling like heavy stones. On paper, Preston is just a minor consultant. You are the sole mastermind behind the entire $80 million laundering operation. He set you up to be the ultimate fall guy. The plausible lie Preston had fed me in my kitchen finally revealed its true monstrous purpose. He had hugged me with tears in his eyes, promising to shield me from stressful corporate lawyers so I could enjoy my golden years. But he was actually building a flawless legal cage around my neck. The foreign syndicate would eventually push their dirty money through Caldwell Tech. The federal authorities would inevitably notice the massive, irregular financial anomalies. They would launch a massive federal investigation. They would raid the corporate offices. And when they seized the hard drives and followed the meticulously crafted paper trail, every single piece of evidence would point directly to a retired machinist living in a modest apartment. My own flesh and blood had orchestrated my funeral. Where is he going? I asked, my voice eerily calm despite the crushing realization. If the federal authorities are going to raid the company, he cannot simply stay in the city and watch it happen. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard again, intercepting a fresh stream of data from his private server. She opened a folder containing his personal encrypted communications. The final puzzle piece snapped into place with terrifying precision. She brought up a set of digital travel itineraries purchased just 12 hours ago. Preston and Brooke were not planning to attend a celebratory board meeting after the $80 million transaction cleared. They had purchased one-way first-class plane tickets to a small private island nation that strictly maintained no extradition treaties with the United States government. Their flight was scheduled to depart at midnight on Friday, exactly 2 hours after the overseas wire transfer was completely finalized. "They are leaving," Sarah said quietly. "They are going to take the $80 million, empty the domestic accounts, and vanish into the wind. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation kicks down your door, Preston will be untouchable on a tropical beach." I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting off my face. The absolute, unadulterated evil of my son's plan settled deep into my bones. He was not just willing to steal the money Evelyn and I had suffered 50 years to save. He was willing to sacrifice my freedom to ensure his own survival. He knew exactly what a federal indictment would mean for a man my age. A trial would bankrupt me. A conviction would destroy my name. I would be locked inside a concrete cell for the rest of my natural life. My son had calculated my life expectancy weighted against his desire for luxury cars and private jets, and decided I was completely disposable. He planned to let me die in a federal penitentiary alone and disgraced. The grief I had carried since Evelyn died was suddenly permanently gone. I was no longer a mourning father. I was a man fighting for his absolute survival. Preston's empire was just another broken machine. "Let us get to work." Sarah closed the offshore banking logs and leaned back in her chair. The rhythmic clicking of her keyboard stopped, leaving heavy silence in the room. She pointed to a single icon resting at the bottom of the master directory. It was a video file shielded by a final layer of encryption. This was the only file remaining on the micro drive. I reached for the mouse, my hand perfectly steady, and double-clicked the icon. The decryption software hummed for a fraction of a second before the dark monitor flickered to life. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a sudden weight press down on my chest. It was Evelyn. She was lying in her sterile hospice bed, propped up against crisp white pillows. The harsh lights cast deep shadows under her cheekbones. She looked incredibly frail, her body ravaged by the illness rapidly stealing her away from me. But her eyes, those sharp, brilliant eyes that had captivated me for 45 years, were ablaze with an absolute, unyielding fire. She stared directly into the camera lens, radiating a fierce determination that transcended her physical weakness. "Hello, William?" Her voice filtered through the computer speakers. It was raspy, exhausted, yet filled with a profound, enduring warmth. "If you are watching this video, it means my plan worked. It means you took the music box to Felix. It means you cracked the password and you are sitting with someone who understands the absolute catastrophe our son engineered. I am so incredibly sorry to leave this burden on your shoulders, my love. But I could not tell you the truth while I was alive. You would have confronted Preston immediately, and he would have legally framed you before you even had a chance to understand the depth of his betrayal." Evelyn paused, taking a slow, labored breath. The heart monitor beeped rhythmically in the background. A tear escaped the corner of her eye. "I discovered what he was doing 5 months ago," she continued, her voice tightening with a mixture of profound sorrow and cold anger. "I was auditing the preliminary venture capital reports when I noticed anomalies in the vendor payables. Our son is not a technology visionary, William. He is a thief. He built a sprawling, highly illegal money laundering syndicate. I spent weeks compiling every single wire transfer and forged signature he used to mask his crimes. I built the shadow ledger you have just seen, but simply proving his guilt would not be enough to protect you." I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on my wife's face. I could feel Sarah sitting beside me, completely captivated by the brilliant woman on the screen. Evelyn shifted slightly in her bed, her expression hardening into the fierce, certified public accountant I always admired. "Preston believes he is the smartest person in any room," Evelyn said, a faint, bitter smile touching her lips. "His arrogance is his ultimate vulnerability. He was so entirely focused on burying his illegal cash flow that he neglected the fundamental architecture of his own corporation. When Caldwell Tech was originally incorporated, there was a single legitimate logistical routing algorithm drafted by an external developer. It was the only genuine intellectual property the company possessed. Preston pitched that specific algorithm to the foreign conglomerate to justify the $80 million acquisition. She looked straight into the lens, her eyes shining with tactical brilliance. But Preston is sloppy William. He never formally transferred the patent rights from the developer to Caldwell Tech. The intellectual property was floating in a state of legal limbo. So 3 months ago, I utilized my power of attorney as the chief financial officer. I quietly purchased the absolute exclusive rights to that algorithm. But I did not register the patents under Caldwell Tech. I registered them entirely under a secret holding company based in Delaware. The magnitude of her maneuver began to dawn on me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened to my wife orchestrate a financial masterpiece from her deathbed. Caldwell Tech does not own a single line of proprietary code, Evelyn declared, her voice ringing with absolute authority. Preston's firm is legally nothing more than a temporary tenant leasing the intellectual property from my hidden Delaware corporation. The foreign syndicate is not paying $80 million for an empty corporate shell. They are paying for the exclusive rights to that specific software patent. When their corporate lawyers conduct the final due diligence audit, just hours before the wire transfer clears, they will discover that Caldwell Tech does not possess the asset they are purchasing. The entire acquisition will instantly evaporate. The syndicate will pull their money, the federal authorities will be alerted, and Preston will be trapped without his golden parachute. A profound, reverent silence filled Sarah's office. My wife had not just gathered evidence. She had systematically dismantled the very foundation of Preston's $80 million escape plan. But there is one final crucial detail, Evelyn whispered, leaning closer to the camera. The Delaware Holding Company requires a designated legal bearer to execute any decisions regarding the intellectual property. I could not simply put your name on the corporate registry. Preston monitors your identity too closely. I had to bury the ownership in a physical, untraceable bearer bond. The legitimate owner of the holding company, the person with the absolute power to deny the patent transfer and destroy the acquisition, is tied to a specific sequence of numbers. She offered me a tender, heartbreaking smile. I embedded the legal bearer code right where Preston would never look. I had Felix engrave the exact corporate registration numbers directly onto the central brass gear inside the music box, the one that plays our song, the one our son always hated. Tears freely streamed down my face. My beautiful, brilliant wife had used her dying days to build an impenetrable fortress around me. She had weaponized Preston's arrogance against him. "William," she said softly, her image beginning to blur through my tears. "You have the ledger to prove his crimes. You have the legal authority to halt the sale. You have the ultimate detonator. Do not let him destroy the legacy of our family. Do not let him use your name. Take this evidence, take the registration numbers, and burn his empire to the absolute ground. I will always love you, my sweet machinist." The video abruptly cut to black. The screen returned to the static menu of the encrypted drive. I sat in the dim light of the office, the profound weight of my wife's genius anchoring me to the leather chair. She had handed me a loaded weapon, perfectly calibrated and ready to fire. I slowly reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy, damp music box I had retrieved from Felix. I traced my calloused thumb over the intricate brass gears. The serial number was etched deeply into the metal, waiting patiently in the dark. I looked over at Sarah. She was staring at the black screen, shaking her head in sheer professional awe. I placed the music box on the desk and stood up. It was time to pull the trigger. The crushing weight of grief that had suffocated me for months evaporated. In its place, a cold, hard resolve forged itself into my spine. I was no longer a mourning widower or a victim waiting to be discarded in a federal prison. I was a machinist. I knew how to dismantle a broken mechanism piece by piece. Sarah understood the shift in my demeanor immediately. She did not offer empty sympathy. She merely nodded her fingers, returning to her mechanical keyboard with a renewed lethal precision. We spent the next 2 hours securing the digital perimeter. Sarah created multiple encrypted backups of Evelyn's shadow ledger, the live data stream from Preston's server room, and the corporate registry files tied to the Delaware holding company. I held the heavy brass music box in my hands, feeling the engraved serial numbers pressing into my skin. It was the absolute proof of my wife's brilliance and her final act of profound love. Once the flash drives were loaded and secured in a waterproof satchel, Sarah permanently wiped the decryption traces from her local servers to prevent any remote counter-surveillance. We walked out of her downtown office into the bright, blinding sunlight of mid-morning. The city moved around us, completely unaware of the massive financial earthquake brewing beneath its surface. We did not go to the local police precinct. A crime of this magnitude, involving international money laundering syndicates and an $80 million corporate shell game, required a much heavier hammer. We drove straight to the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal building was a towering structure of concrete and tinted glass. Security was absolute. We navigated the metal detectors and approached the reinforced reception desk. Getting an immediate audience with high-level federal agents is usually an impossible task for a walk-in civilian. But Sarah knew exactly what language to speak. She handed the duty officer a single sealed envelope containing a brief summary of the offshore routing numbers and the specific international banking institutions involved in the impending $80 million acquisition. She simply told the officer that we possessed actionable real-time intelligence regarding a massive transnational money laundering syndicate operating through a domestic technology firm. It took less than 10 minutes for 2 armed agents to escort us to a secure elevator. They brought us to a soundproof conference room on the secure operations floor. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and ozone. 3 senior agents from the Financial Crimes Unit entered shortly after. The lead agent, a tall man with sharp evaluating eyes named Harrison, introduced himself and asked us to lay out our claims. I did not speak at first. I simply placed the heavy brass music box on the center of the long metal table. Then Sarah opened her secured laptop and connected it to the digital projector mounted on the ceiling. Over the next 2 hours, we methodically dismantled my son's entire life. We walked them through the hollow framework of Caldwell Tech. We showed them the phantom artificial intelligence software, the fabricated operational algorithms, and the devastating reality of the 3-year Ponzi scheme. We showed them how my life savings had been bled dry to fund private jets, luxury cars, and Brooke's relentless shopping sprees. The agents sat in absolute, stony silence, taking meticulous notes as the staggering scale of the domestic fraud was laid bare. But the atmosphere in the room shifted from professional interest to profound shock when Sarah brought up the international data. She projected the live decrypted feed from the transponder I had installed in Preston's mansion. The agents watched in real time as the overseas syndicate began routing preliminary test wires through the shadowy banking channels. Harrison leaned forward, his jaw tight. They had been trying to build a solid case against this specific foreign syndicate for 5 years, but the criminals had always hidden behind impenetrable layers of international corporate secrecy. Preston was eagerly opening the front door to the United States financial system for them. Then I presented Evelyn's final masterstroke. I handed Harrison the printed documents detailing the blind trust Preston had forced upon me, along with the forged signatures designating me as the sole legal chief executive officer of the shell corporations. I explained my son's plan to board a flight to a non-extradition country the moment the syndicate wired the funds, leaving me behind to face the federal raid and rot in a penitentiary. But then I showed them the Delaware holding company registry. I explained how my late wife in her final days had legally purchased the core logistical patents and severed them from Caldwell Tech. I pointed to the music box resting on the table and revealed that the true legal bearer of the intellectual property was determined by the serial number etched into its brass gears. The agents were absolutely stunned. They stared at the meticulous paper trail Evelyn had constructed from her hospice bed. It was a flawless, legally binding trap. Agent Harrison immediately called for a tactical response team to raid Caldwell Tech and arrest Preston on the spot. But I raised my hand, stopping him. I looked directly into his eyes, my voice steady and cold. I told him that if they raided the mansion now, Preston would simply claim ignorance and the foreign syndicate would instantly pull their money and vanish back into the shadows. We needed a definitive, crushing victory. I proposed a highly coordinated sting operation. We needed to let Preston walk right up to the absolute finish line. We had to let him sit in his luxurious boardroom surrounded by his wealthy, deceived investors. We had to let the foreign syndicate fully commit their funds, transferring the $80 million directly into the domestic escrow account. The moment that dirty money hit the American banking system, the federal government would have the legal jurisdiction to seize every single penny and arrest the syndicate's domestic facilitators. And at that exact second, I would deploy the Delaware Holding Company documents. I would legally block the transfer of the intellectual property, rendering the acquisition completely void and trapping Preston in the middle of a massive, undeniable federal crime. He would have the foreign syndicate's stolen money securely isolated inside an escrow account. He could not access a hollow fake company he could not possibly sell, and an overwhelming army of heavily armed federal agents permanently blocking his only avenue of escape. Harrison slowly looked at his dedicated tactical team, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his weathered face. He immediately agreed to the flawless plan. We spent the remainder of the long afternoon perfectly synchronizing our secure communications and firmly establishing the absolute tactical timeline. The suffocating grief was finally gone. The paralyzing shock had completely passed. I walked confidently out of the towering federal building, with the heavy brass weight of the music box resting securely in my dark coat pocket, completely ready for this coming war. My son thought he was the smartest man in the entire world. He was about to learn exactly what happens when you truly underestimate a dedicated master machinist. My son thought he was the smartest man in the entire world. He was about to learn exactly what happens when you truly underestimate a dedicated master machinist. I returned to my quiet apartment as the evening shadows began to stretch across the worn carpet. The silence of the rooms felt completely different tonight. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a widower mourning his lost wife. It was the taut, vibrating silence of a hunter waiting in the blind. I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and stood by the window watching the city lights flicker to life one by one in the gathering dark. Somewhere out there in his sprawling glass and concrete mansion, Preston was undoubtedly celebrating. He was likely pouring expensive champagne, toasting to his own undeniable brilliance, entirely convinced that his $80 million escape plan was flawlessly executed. He thought the heavy oak door of his secure server room had perfectly protected his dark secrets. He thought the thick stack of legal documents I signed had permanently sealed my fate. He had absolutely no idea that a massive net of federal agents was already weaving itself tightly around his corporate headquarters, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The waiting was a unique kind of psychological torture, a slow burn of adrenaline that required absolute discipline to control. I brewed a cup of black tea, my hands perfectly steady, and sat in my armchair to watch the clock tick away the final hours of my son's fraudulent empire. At exactly 8 o'clock, the sharp ringing of my cell phone shattered the quiet calm of my living room. I glanced down at the illuminated screen. The caller identification displayed Preston's name. A cold wave of anticipation washed over me. I took a slow, deep breath, carefully lowering my heart rate. I had to play my role perfectly, one last time. I could not let a single ounce of my cold fury bleed through the receiver. I cleared my throat, forcing a slight raspy weakness into my vocal cords, and answered the call. "Hello, Preston," I said, keeping my tone gentle and slightly hesitant. Exactly how a tired, confused old man would sound at the end of a very long day. "Dad," his voice boomed through the speaker, dripping with an artificial, sickeningly sweet affection. "I was just calling to check on you. How are you feeling tonight? I am all right, son, I replied softly. Just a little tired. My bones ache when the weather turns cold. Well, you just rest, Dad, Preston said, his voice smooth and entirely practiced. I wanted to call and give you the good news. Tomorrow is the big day. The corporate buyout is officially closing at noon. All the paperwork is finalized, the legal teams have signed off, and the funds are ready to be transferred. You do not have to worry about a single thing ever again. The sheer unadulterated sociopathy required to speak those words almost took my breath away. He was cheerfully informing me that the steel trap he built for me was finally snapping shut. He was telling me to relax while he prepared to abandon me to federal investigators and flee the country with $80 million of laundered money. That is wonderful news, Preston, I murmured, forcing a warm, genuine-sounding smile into my voice. I know how incredibly hard you have worked for this company. Your mother and I always knew you were destined for great things. I appreciate that, Dad, Preston replied, the smug satisfaction clearly audible in his arrogant tone. I really do. This acquisition is going to secure our family legacy forever. The blind trust is fully operational, and your retirement is absolutely secure. I just want you to be comfortable and safe. I love you, Dad. Hearing my son say he loved me, knowing he had booked a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country, twisted a sharp knife deep inside my chest. But the pain only fueled my absolute resolve. I leaned back in my armchair, staring at the dark wall, and mirrored his deceit with chilling precision. I love you too, Preston, I said, my voice trembling with staged emotional pride. I am so incredibly proud of the man you have become. You have taken my small investment and built an empire. I know your mother is looking down on you right now, and she is just as proud as I am. You have done perfectly, son. There was a brief pause on the line. For a fraction of a second, I wondered if my mention of Evelyn had penetrated his thick armor of greed. But his response was swift and entirely hollow. Thank you, Dad, he said smoothly. That means everything to me. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a monumental day for all of us. I will have Brooke call you in the afternoon to check in. Good night, Preston, I whispered. I pressed the red button to end the call and placed the phone face down on the table. The psychological tension that had built up in the room slowly dissipated, leaving behind a heavy metallic silence. I had just spoken to my son for the very last time as a free, wealthy man. The paternal bond that had existed between us was officially irreversibly severed. He was no longer my child. He was an adversary who had actively tried to destroy my life, and I was the machinist who was going to dismantle him piece by piece. I stood up from my armchair and walked down the short hallway to my bedroom. I opened the door to my small, narrow closet. Pushed all the way to the back, hanging quietly inside a protective plastic garment bag, was my sharpest, darkest suit. It was a tailored charcoal wool suit, conservative and meticulously maintained. It was the exact suit I had worn 6 months ago to Evelyn's funeral. I had stood by her grave in this dark fabric, weeping for the loss of my brilliant partner, entirely unaware that my own son was using her death as an opportunity to steal our life savings. I unzipped the plastic bag and pulled the suit out into the dim light of the bedroom. The fabric felt heavy and substantial between my fingers. I began the slow, deliberate ritual of getting dressed. I put on a crisp, starched white shirt, buttoning it up to the collar with steady, precise movements. I tied a dark silk tie, pulling the knot tight against my throat. I slipped my arms into the charcoal jacket, feeling the familiar weight settle across my broad shoulders. I stood in front of the tall mirror bolted to the back of my bedroom door. The frail, shaking, broken old man that Preston had seen yesterday was completely gone. The man staring back at me in the glass was hardened steel, polished, and ready for absolute war. I walked back out to the kitchen counter. The heavy brass music box sat perfectly still, gleaming softly under the overhead light. I picked it up, feeling the intricate gears and the engraved serial numbers that held the legal power to obliterate Preston's $80 million transaction. I opened a small black leather briefcase and carefully placed the music box inside, securing it against the padded lining. I snapped the metallic latches shut. The sharp click echoed through the empty apartment, like a hammer pulling back on a revolver. I checked my watch. The night was deepening, marching relentlessly toward the morning. I turned off the kitchen light, gripped the leather handle of my briefcase, and prepared to execute my son's professional destruction. The time for sorrow had officially ended, and the time for absolute consequence had finally arrived. The morning sun glared off the towering glass facade of the Caldwell Tech headquarters as our black federal vehicles pulled to a sudden stop at the main entrance. I stepped out onto the pristine concrete pavement, gripping the sturdy handle of my black leather briefcase. The heavy brass music box rested securely inside an invisible bomb, ready to completely detonate. Sarah Jenkins walked calmly to my left, holding her own briefcase packed with the decrypted ledgers and the legally binding addendum Preston had blindly signed. To my right, Agent Harrison and 3 other armed federal agents fell into a tight, highly disciplined formation around me. They wore immaculate dark suits, their posture radiating quiet, absolute authority. We moved toward the revolving glass doors as a single unstoppable unit. The sleek, modern lobby was a monument to false success. Towering marble pillars and massive digital screens displayed the Caldwell Tech logo in glowing blue light. 2 young security guards in tailored uniforms stepped forward, raising their hands to block our path. Agent Harrison did not even slow his stride. He simply reached into his breast pocket, smoothly produced his golden federal badge, and held it up to the guards' faces. The guards froze instantly, their eyes widening in shock, and backed away, their hands dropping to their sides in silent submission. We bypassed the reception desk entirely and marched directly toward the private executive elevators. Harrison pressed the call button, his face a mask of cold, tactical focus. The polished steel doors slid open with a soft chime, welcoming us into the belly of the beast. We rode the elevator in complete silence, watching the digital floor numbers climb higher and higher. I felt the familiar hum of the machinery beneath my feet, grounding me in the present moment. I was a machinist, and I was about to dismantle a corrupt machine. We reached the top floor, the executive penthouse level, reserved exclusively for high-stakes negotiations. The doors parted, revealing a sprawling, opulent reception area bathed in natural light. Thick carpets absorbed the sound of our footsteps as we moved past rows of empty desks. The entire floor had been deliberately cleared of regular employees to ensure total privacy for the illegal transaction. At the very end of the wide corridor stood the primary boardroom. The walls were constructed entirely of reinforced soundproof glass, offering a panoramic, breathtaking view of the city skyline. As we approached the glass walls, I could clearly see the final act of Preston's grand illusion unfolding inside. Preston stood at the head of a massive, polished mahogany table, his charismatic smile stretched wide across his face. Brooke stood right beside him, wearing a stunning, incredibly expensive white designer dress, holding a crystal flute of sparkling champagne. Seated around the long table were 5 men in sharp, dark European suits. They were the shadowy proxies for the overseas money laundering syndicate, the ruthless bankers who were perfectly willing to purchase a hollow company to wash their dirty capital. A thick, leather-bound contract rested squarely in the center of the table. Preston picked up a heavy gold pen. He held it up in the sunlight, laughing charmingly at a joke made by one of the syndicate proxies. He was soaking in the absolute glory of his final ultimate victory. Brooke raised her crystal glass, a triumphant smile blooming on her lips. Preston lowered his arm, the tip of the gold pen hovering mere inches above the signature line that would finalize the $80 million transaction. The escrow funds were undoubtedly waiting in the digital ether, completely ready to flood into his accounts. I stepped ahead of the federal agents. I firmly placed my hands on the heavy, solid oak doors that served as the grand entrance to the boardroom. I did not knock. I did not hesitate. I pushed the massive wooden doors wide open with a sudden, violent force. The heavy oak slammed hard against the interior walls with a deafening, thunderous crack that shook the glass panes. The sudden noise shattered the refined, celebratory atmosphere inside the room like a physical blow. Every single head snapped toward the doorway in absolute shock. I walked slowly into the center of the expansive room, my posture straight, my shoulders broad, and my eyes as cold and hard as chipped ice. Sarah walked closely at my side, her face completely unreadable. Agent Harrison and his 3 armed men fanned out immediately behind us, moving with practiced military precision to block the heavy oak doors physically sealing all the occupants inside the room. Preston jumped back from the table, his hand spasming. The heavy gold pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the polished mahogany surface before rolling off the edge and hitting the thick carpet. His charming smile instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He stared at me, his eyes wide and completely uncomprehending, as if a dead man had just walked out of a grave and stepped into his private sanctuary. Brooke let out a sharp, genuine gasp. Her hand jerked violently, sending the crystal champagne flute crashing to the floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces, the expensive liquid soaking into the luxurious rug. The 5 syndicate proxies immediately tensed their hands, dropping subtly beneath the edge of the heavy table, their predatory instincts instantly recognizing the undeniable presence of federal law enforcement. "What in the world is going on here?" Preston finally stammered, his voice rising in an unnatural, frantic pitch. He frantically looked from my cold face to the grim, unsmiling federal agents securing the exits. He desperately tried to reclaim his shattered authority, clinging blindly to his meticulously constructed illusion. "Security!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with rising panic. "Where is the damn security? Get this crazy old man out of my building right now!" He pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. "He is delusional!" Preston shouted desperately to the confused, silent syndicate proxies. "He is my father, but he is incredibly sick. He suffers from severe dementia. He does not know where he is or what he is doing. He just wanders around making these pathetic scenes. Please, gentlemen, I apologize for this ridiculous interruption. I have full legal power of attorney over him. I will have him removed immediately so we can conclude our business." I did not say a word. I did not defend myself against his frantic, pathetic lies. I simply walked forward until I reached the opposite end of the long mahogany table standing directly across from my terrified son. I placed my black leather briefcase squarely onto the polished wood. The soft thud echoed loudly in the tense, silent room. The syndicate proxies watched me with narrow, calculating eyes, clearly sensing that the narrative Preston was spinning was rapidly falling apart. I looked Preston dead in the eye. I allowed the absolute crushing reality of his situation to finally wash over his panicked face. I was not shaking. I was not crying. I was not the frail, pathetic old man he mocked and dismissed just 24 hours past. "You are not throwing anyone out today, Preston." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the sudden, suffocating weight of shifting power. I reached for the brass latches of my black leather briefcase. They snapped open with a sharp metallic crack that made Brooke flinch. I reached inside and pulled out the heavy brass music box. It was a beautiful, intricate piece of machinery, a testament to a lifetime of honest labor. I lifted it high and slammed it down onto the center of the polished mahogany table. The impact sent a deep, vibrating thud through the wood, echoing against the soundproof glass walls. Preston stared at the brass box, his face draining of all color. He recognized it instantly. It was the very same object he had mocked, the sentimental garbage he thought he had discarded. Sarah Jenkins moved smoothly past me, stepping confidently up to the table. She unzipped her own briefcase and pulled out a stack of crisp, perfectly collated legal files. These were the Delaware Holding Company documents, the ultimate manifestation of Evelyn's brilliant foresight. Without saying a single word, Sarah began distributing the thick files directly to the 5 syndicate proxies. They snatched the papers with nervous, hurried hands, their eyes darting between the armed federal agents blocking the doors and the dense legal text on the pages before them. You do not own the logistical routing algorithms you are attempting to sell, I said, my voice cutting through the tense air like a scalpel. You do not own the artificial intelligence software. Caldwell Tech is nothing more than a temporary tenant. The core intellectual property belongs exclusively to a private holding company, and the legal bearer of that company is tied directly to the serial number engraved inside the gears of this music box. I looked Preston dead in the eye, watching the realization dawn on him. The golden parachute he had spent years weaving was disintegrating before his very eyes. As the sole legal owner of the intellectual property, I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. I am officially revoking your right to transfer, sell, or license any of the core software. This acquisition is permanently canceled. The $80 million transaction is void. You have absolutely nothing to sell. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. The syndicate proxies, however, did not freeze. They were seasoned criminals, and they instantly recognized the fatal geometry of the situation. The lead proxy, a man with cold, dead eyes, dropped the legal file onto the table as if it were on fire. He whispered a harsh, urgent command in a foreign language to his associates. The 5 men moved simultaneously. They shoved their heavy leather chairs backward, scrambling frantically away from the mahogany table. They lunged toward the heavy oak doors, their faces twisted in absolute panic. They knew the federal government was closing the net, and they desperately needed to escape before the domestic trap completely shut. But they were far too late. Agent Harrison stepped forward, his hand resting casually but firmly on his holstered weapon. The 3 other federal agents mirrored his movement, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of dark suits and hardened authority. Nobody leaves this room. Harrison commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that froze the syndicate men in their tracks. This entire building is currently under federal lockdown. You are all being detained for active participation in a transnational money laundering syndicate. The proxies slowly raised their hands, backing away from the doors, their expensive European suits suddenly looking like prison uniforms. Preston watched his entire empire collapse in real time. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. Brooke stood frozen beside him, her hands covering her mouth, silent tears ruining her immaculate makeup. Dad. Preston finally choked out his voice, a pathetic, trembling whisper. Dad, please. You cannot do this. We are family. I was just trying to secure our future. It was a misunderstanding. I would never hurt you. His lies were so deeply ingrained that he could not stop telling them even as the walls closed in around him. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the burning anger I felt. I simply reached into the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and opened the audio file Sarah had extracted from their private server communications. I turned the volume to the maximum setting and pressed play. Preston's own arrogant, mocking voice filled the silent boardroom, echoing off the glass walls for everyone to hear. My dad is a clueless old man. The digital recording played the sound perfectly clear and undeniable. He is so focused on his grief that he cannot see what is happening right under his nose. Once this works, when we wash the money, so we can push him out completely. Declare him incompetent if we have to. And if things go south, we use the blind trust. Everything is in his name. If the feds come knocking, he is the one who takes the fall, not us. We will be on a beach before he even knows he has been indicted. The audio recording clicked off, leaving a ringing, devastating silence in its wake. Brooke let out a loud, wretched sob, finally realizing that their flawless escape plan had been entirely dismantled. Preston stared at me, his eyes hollow and defeated. He had nothing left to say. There were no more lies to spin, no more illusions to project. I walked slowly around the edge of the polished mahogany table, closing the physical distance between us. The federal agents maintained their strict perimeter, their eyes constantly scanning the room for any sudden movements. The 5 syndicate proxies remained perfectly still. their hands raised in silent submission, entirely neutralized by the overwhelming law enforcement presence. I stopped right in front of Preston. I looked at the tailored navy blue suit he wore, the expensive silk tie, and the custom leather shoes bought with stolen money. He was a complete fabrication, a hollow shell of a man entirely devoid of morality or conscience. "You thought my grief made me blind," I said softly, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet boardroom. "You thought my love for your mother had me weak, but Evelyn saw exactly who you were. She saw the rot inside your corporate empire. She spent her final days ensuring that your absolute greed would become your ultimate cage. You built this trap, Preston. We just locked the door." Agent Harrison stepped forward from the doorway, producing a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. The cold, clinking sound of the heavy metal echoed loudly through the room. "Preston Caldwell, you are under formal arrest," Harrison stated clearly, his voice leaving no room for argument or negotiation. "Turn around and place your hands firmly behind your back. You have the absolute right to remain completely silent." I turned my back on my son, leaving him to the federal agents. The old master machinist had successfully dismantled the broken machine. The long debt was finally entirely paid. The silence following the arrest shattered with a piercing shriek. Brooke backed away from the mahogany table as if it caught fire. Her white designer dress mocked the absolute squalor of her current reality. She stared wildly at the agents, then turned her frantic gaze toward Preston. The facade of the supportive corporate wife dissolved in seconds. She screamed at him, her voice echoing shrilly against the soundproof glass. She yelled that he lied about the offshore accounts and capital reports. She frantically waved her hands, desperate to physically distance herself from the monumental fraud unfolding. She looked at Agent Harrison and cried out that she knew nothing about the laundering syndicate or the fraudulent patents. She claimed she was just a victim of his psychological manipulation, entirely ignorant of the illegal wires and shell companies. It was a spectacular, immediate betrayal. She was throwing the man she loved to the wolves without a second of hesitation, desperate to save her own skin from federal indictment. Preston did not even look at her. His carefully manicured world was collapsing in slow motion, and the sheer velocity of the destruction completely paralyzed his mind. He looked at the 5 syndicate proxies, standing against the far wall with their hands raised. Their eyes were no longer polite or deferential. They stared at my son with a cold, terrifying promise of future violence. They were men who dealt in blood, and Preston had marched them directly into a massive federal trap. He realized in that agonizing moment that even if he survived federal prosecution, the cartel would never stop hunting him for losing $80 million. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pallid gray. His breathing became shallow and erratic. The invincible corporate titan who sneered at my grief was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, broken boy who finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of his own catastrophic arrogance. The heavy steel handcuffs dangled from the federal grip, catching sunlight pouring through the expansive windows. The reality of the handcuffs finally broke his psychological dam. Preston let out a guttural sob that tore through his throat. His knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed onto the thick carpet in his $1,000 custom-tailored suit. He ignored the federal agents surrounding him and scrambled frantically across the floor toward me. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the fabric of my trousers. He clung to my legs, weeping openly and uncontrollably. The sheer indignity of his posture was absolute. He begged me to stop the agents. He pleaded with me to hand over the brass music box and sign the intellectual property rights back to Caldwell Tech. He cried that the cartel would kill him if the acquisition failed. He sobbed that he was my only son and that Evelyn would never want to see him rot in a federal penitentiary. He used every manipulative tactic he learned, weaponizing the memory of Evelyn and our shared blood in a desperate attempt to save himself from the undeniable consequences of his own actions. His tears soaked into the fabric of my dark suit, leaving damp, shameful stains around my ankles. I looked down at the boy I had raised. I looked at the dark hair and facial features that so closely resembled my own. For 40 years, I poured every ounce of my love, labor, and sacrifice into ensuring his success. I worked double shifts in the machine shop to pay for his elite education. I stood silently by while he dismissed my trade and mocked my modest lifestyle. I blindly trusted him when he forced me into a fraudulent blind trust. And yet, as I stood there listening to his pathetic pleading, I searched my heart for a single shred of paternal mercy. I searched for the anger that kept me awake for the past 6 months. I searched for the profound sorrow that nearly destroyed me after Evelyn passed away. But I found absolutely nothing. My chest was entirely hollow. The emotional bond tying me to this treacherous creature had been completely and permanently severed. I felt no pity for the weeping man clutching my legs. I felt no triumph in his absolute destruction. I only felt the cold, mechanical certainty of a complex equation finally balancing itself out. Action had simply met an equal and opposite reaction. I reached down and firmly pried his trembling hands off my trousers. I stepped back, forcing him to fall forward onto his hands and knees. I reached toward the mahogany table and picked up the heavy brass music box. I felt the comforting weight of the metal and the sharp edges of the engraved serial numbers pressing against my palm. I slipped the intricate machine securely into the deep side pocket of my dark charcoal coat. I looked down at Preston one final time. He stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes, begging for a miracle that was never going to come. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice low, steady, and devoid of human emotion. "Trash belongs with trash," I whispered, perfectly echoing the exact venomous words he had used to describe my long labor days before. The words hung in the quiet air, a final lethal verdict delivered without an ounce of hesitation. I turned my back on my son. I did not look at Brooke, who was still weeping in the corner. I did not look at the syndicate proxies or the federal agents. I simply walked toward the heavy oak doors, my posture straight and my conscience entirely clear. Sarah Jenkins fell into step beside me as we crossed the expansive room. Her presence was a silent comfort, a testament to the undeniable power of meticulous preparation and absolute truth. The sunlight streaming through the towering glass walls felt remarkably warm against my face, chasing away the lingering chill of the previous 6 months. As I reached the massive wooden doorway, I paused for just a fraction of a second on the thick threshold. Behind me, the grim reality of federal law enforcement was taking total control of the space. Agent Harrison issued a series of sharp, decisive commands to his tactical team, securing the physical evidence and officially detaining the foreign conspirators. The heavy metallic sound of steel handcuffs clicking firmly shut around the wrists of Preston echoed sharply across the room, finalizing his descent from grace. That sharp, ringing click was the ultimate punctuation mark on his fraudulent existence. It was the absolute end of his $80 million illusion. I walked out of the glass room and stepped into the quiet executive corridor, leaving the ruins of Caldwell Tech completely behind me. The long, exhausting war was finally over. My beautiful Evelyn could truly rest in peace, knowing her brilliant mind had secured my ultimate safety. I walked steadily toward the waiting, polished steel elevators, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the heavy brass music box resting securely against my side. I pressed the call button, breathed in the cool, crisp morning air, and stood completely ready to finally begin the calm, quiet, peaceful rest of my long life. The months that followed the massive federal raid on Caldwell Tech were an absolute whirlwind of federal indictments, asset seizures, and bitter courtroom battles. Preston and Brooke faced the full, crushing weight of the United States criminal justice system. Their highly publicized trial exposed every single layer of their elaborate deceit, laying bare the absolute blinding arrogance that drove them to steal millions. The prosecution was swift and unmerciful. They were convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate conspiracy, and international money laundering. The federal judge, a remarkably stern woman with zero tolerance for wealthy corporate predators, sentenced my son and his wife to 15 years each in a maximum security federal penitentiary. All of their stolen assets were immediately and permanently seized by the government. The luxurious mansion in the hills, the private jets, the sports cars, and the designer wardrobes were auctioned off to pay restitution. They were left with absolutely nothing at all, stripped of their wealth and their freedom in one swift motion. With the criminal element neutralized, I turned my attention to cleaning up the wreckage they left behind. Utilizing Sarah Jenkins and her unmatched legal brilliance, we waded through the complicated corporate bankruptcy proceedings. We worked directly with the federal receivership to recover a large portion of the frozen funds. My primary goal was not to enrich myself, but to make things right for the people Preston had actively swindled. We meticulously tracked down the small investors, the men and women who believed in my son's false promises and had their savings wiped out. We successfully reimbursed them, returning the hard-earned money they had lost and restoring a measure of true justice to a terrible situation. The dark stain my son left on our family name was officially scrubbed clean. Once the final legal documents were signed and the corporate nightmare was truly over, I packed my bags and permanently moved out of the cold, bustling city. The relentless noise and the towering concrete held far too many bitter memories. I bought a quiet, beautiful piece of remote, undeveloped land in the deep country, nestled right against the edge of a vast, tranquil lake. The crisp air there was impeccably clean, smelling intensely of pine needles and fresh water. I used the remainder of my legitimate savings to build a large, fully equipped mechanical workshop right on the property. I did not open this new shop for commercial profit. I opened it as a dedicated community center, a safe place dedicated to teaching inner-city youth the true value of honest, rigorous mechanical work. I wanted to teach young men and women the quiet dignity of working with their hands, of understanding how complex machines function, and of building something real and tangible from the absolute ground up. It was the exact, enduring legacy my beautiful Evelyn and I had always wanted to leave behind. A legacy of education, honest labor, and unyielding personal integrity. Now I spend my days happily covered in machine oil, teaching a bright new generation how to perfectly measure tolerances and cut raw steel. And in the quiet evenings I sit alone on my wooden porch, watching the golden sunset brilliantly reflect off the calm surface of the lake. I take the heavy brass music box out of my pocket and place it gently on the small table beside my chair. I slowly wind the intricate gears, listening to the soft clicks of the delicate mechanism. The familiar melody plays crisp and perfect, drifting beautifully out over the darkening water. I am 70 years old today. I completely lost my son to the blinding power of absolute greed. But as I listen to our song playing in the twilight, I know with absolute certainty that I kept my soul, my freedom, and my wife's honor entirely intact. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, true respect, and integrity make you family. Never allow the love you hold for your children to blind you to the reality of their actions. True parenting sometimes means stepping aside and letting the crushing weight of consequences fall upon those who believe they can exploit your sacrifices without paying the price. Greed is a dark fire that completely consumes the vessel carrying it. Do not let them drag you into the flames. Stand your ground, protect your peace, and remember that your dignity is worth more than a hollow relationship built on exploitation. Have you ever had to enforce tough love on a family member? To protect your own peace, share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe for more real-life lessons, and don't forget to ring the bell. See you next time.